Catching worms for profit or fishing isn't complicated, but it isn't easy either. It's pretty hard on your lower back and can be quite tedious, but don't let that get in the way. Picking worms is fun and satisfying all at the same time. The key is to get the right location and conditions. My preferred picking territory is bare or mud-covered ground. This is often found in a freshly turned garden. But when that is not available, shortcut grass will do the trick. Long grass will do too, but it's often quite a bit harder to see worms mixed in with all the rest. Early spring and late fall are great seasons for worm picking. The dead dry of summer usually leads to slim pickings, so to speak, unless you get a prolonged rain which drenches the soil long enough to trigger the worms to emerge. There are times when it rains for short periods of time, and that's not enough to produce ideal conditions. And that's the real key. Dew worms need moisture, and lots of it. Propelled higher to the surface, worms will become unearthed all by their own so long as it has rained long enough to keep the worm's body moist and prevent it drying. These moist conditions can also occur from early morning dew, but the real catch happens when it rains long enough to saturate the soil deeply. You will rarely see worms in broad daylight as it exposes them to harsh, dry sunlight and also predators. Worms are hermaphroditic, but cannot mate under soil due to how they must be positioned. Rain, warmth, and darkness is the cue for them to break the surface of the ground in search of a suitable partner. And they probably aren't very picky either. In fact, any close neighbor will do. Bad for the worm, but ideal for the opportunistic dew worm picker. Worms will hold half in and half out of their holes. When grassed or disturbed, their setae, tiny hair-like projections or bristles, will extend outward to anchor themselves against their burrow. They will work with their entire might and contract their longitudinal muscles in order to shorten their body so as to prevent themselves from being taken. These muscles run the length of their body. However, they will soon tire and release. It is important not to tug too hard or the entire worm may split in two. Further to this, their circular muscles, when contracted, serve to stretch their body. Naturally, a combination of both muscles working in concert make the worm move forward. Circular muscles contract to elongate, and then setae lock on, and their longitudinal muscles contract to shorten their body, propelling it forward. Simple locomotion. Worms are quite sensitive to both light and vibration. Walking with heavy feet will send the worm back into the burrow, as will a hastily cast light. It's imperative to be sneaky around the worms, and it's not uncommon to send 6 worms into burrow when pulling one out. The best nights for picking tend to be when rain has been persistent and continues into the night, as well as elevated temperatures. It's not long after dark that the worms will emerge. Even after worms have been disturbed, they will come back out shortly afterwards, so a small area can be worked and reworked more than once. The most ideal spots tend to be located around houses, drive edges, where water is funneled off. Worms are invasive, but also a welcome addition to Canada. They stem from Europe and Asian settlers who supplanted them sometime after the Ice Age in potting soil and ship's ballasts. Worms are prolific, and it is estimated that they reach into the trillions in Ontario alone. As a cash crop, they yield anywhere from 40 to 400 million. It's really hard to know for certain since much of the industry operates underground and out of sight from the taxman. A good picker on a good night may pull a worm every 4 to 5 seconds, or about 1,000 worms an hour. On a 6-hour shift, that's 6,000 worms, and at 15 to 30 per thousand to a commercial picker, it produces only a living wage. A record pick produced over 22,000 worms in one night. To the angler, however, it's a substantial savings, as a dozen worms currently total about $4 Canadian, so the effective wage runs at 1,000 worms an hour, or $4,000 per hour. Of course, one doesn't personally need 1,000 worms, but you get the point. The savings are meaningful. To pick isn't complicated. All one needs is a flashlight held by hand or a head mount variety. Professionals will use sawdust to keep their fingers dry, but this isn't necessary. Using a fanny mount system to carry worms or strapping buckets to one's legs for sawdust and worms is ideal, but certainly not required. I merely carry a light and small bucket in one hand, leaving the other hand free for picking. I've never picked in anything more exotic than the cow pasture, and pickings weren't spectacular either. In our childhood, my brother, sister, and I ran a local dew-wort company. We nearly always picked an area the size of an acre around our childhood home, and we never depleted its stock. We ran our small business from picking, packaging, to selling. Most of our clientele came from a nearby tourist fish camp which was owned by my grandfather. As he aged, he gave up selling bait himself, and so my dad passed his picking knowledge on to us. By the end of the summer, we had a stack of $2 bills which we diligently divided and dutifully spent on candy for the remainder of the year. A good soybean field, I'm told, can hold dozens of visible worms every square yard, but even the mediocre pickings we had could fill a large ice cream bucket or two clear to the top with no soil, and that's with 3 novice pickers. If my memory serves me correctly, I believe our record pick was estimated to be around 2,000 worms, more than enough stock for our small business. I think my dad chipped in a few too along the way, but it wasn't long before we were doing most of the labor ourselves. Picking is not complicated, but telling one end of the worm from the other is part of the puzzle. Find the hole and aim for the end closest to it. Reaching for the head of the worm and coming up short will produce a miss. Grab firmly and pull, but not too firmly or you will snap the worm in two, rendering it useless. It's a myth that a worm can regenerate if broken, as there are only a few segments in which a break does not result in a quick death. When disturbed, worms will move back into their holes within a second unless they have made the mistake of coming clean out. On good nights, mating pairs will be abundant. This occurs when 2 worms lock themselves together and exchange sperm with each other so as to fertilize their eggs. The lump on the earthworm body is called the celtellum. The earthworm will move this lump over its body, picking up eggs first, and then over the male pore where sperm is stored. The slime tube is then closed out, forming an egg cocoon which is deposited in the soil. In a mating paired state, earthworms are easy to catch, but will separate and retreat if given enough time. Grab both if you can. Storing and keeping worms alive is easy. Simply mix 50% to 60% peat moss with soil or compost. The mixture should be saturated with moisture, but not so much that there is liquid water present. Soil that is too dry will suffocate the worms since they transpire through their skin. Add worms by placing them on top of the soil and let them go down on their own. Dead worms will remain at the top rather than burrow, so you can discard these right away. Check for dead worms the next morning or in a few days. If you find live worms at the top, then you will want to add more soil or add an additional container as the worm density may be too high. This may cause issues with long-term storage. Worms should be monitored often for conditions and health. An off smell or rotting means you need to investigate further and discard dead worms. Place them in the refrigerator on the bottom shelf. Worms will go nearly dormant at these temperatures, so don't require much to eat. Make sure that there is a way for air to be exchanged in the container so the worms can breathe. For long-term storage, add dead dry leaves or newspaper. I have kept worms over winter as an experiment and they fared well. Worms consume all variety of dead and decaying organic matter. If you plan to keep the worms for a long while, aim to change the soil out and be sure to discard any dead worms. Also be sure to separate any worms that might be coiled around one another. This usually doesn't end well for them. Soil that has had worms in them makes great compost for the garden. If you're a worm fisher and you don't pick worms, consider that a great sin. Worms are easy to pick, and of all the fishing I do, I only rarely buy worms from a commercial seller. When I do, it's usually because of bad timing or because I have exhausted my supply. Other times, I miss ideal picking opportunities or pick too few worms. A few outings per season usually gives me plenty of stock.